with a voicemail from Dad. Oh? I was halfway through raising my glass when Ethan's voice sliced through the chatter. Grandma, don't drink that. The room froze. Woodfine buzzed with a voicemail from. Forks hovered mid-air. The laughter from my son's friends at the far end died like someone had shut a door on it. I turned my head slowly. Fly from Dad, and at the stem of the glass cold in my fingers. My grandson's wide brown trembling locked on mine. From her dad. His little hands were clenched, so tight the knuckles went white. What? My voice came out in a whisper. With a voicemail from Dad, almost drowned by the hum of the refrigerator in the corner. Ethan shook his head once. Not fast. Deliberate? Please. I looked around the table. I'm buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. My daughter-in-law Melissa was smiling, not the kind of smile that warms a room. This one was too tight, too polished, like it had been glued on. My son, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Daniel stared at the turkey platter as though carving it in his mind. The glass was sweating in my hand. Cold condensation slid down my palm. The voicemail from Dad, a slow trickle that made me shiver. It was cranberry juice, or so I'd been told. A holiday toast, they'd said. Go on, Mom, Melissa murmured. Her voicemail from Dad, her voice honeyed but thin. We're all waiting. Her eyes met mine for a fraction of a second, just long enough for me to see the flicker. Satisfaction. When buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, my throat tightened. The room felt hotter, though a draft from the back door carried in the scent of pine and frost. With a voicemail from Dad. I thought of every Thanksgiving I'd hosted in this very kitchen. The smell of fresh bread from my oven. Not store, bought rolls tossed carelessly in a basket. I've buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The clatter of my dishes, not these sleek white plates she'd brought in from her own set. And now here I was, a guest at my own table, with a voicemail from Dad. I set the glass down slow enough for the base to make a soft clink against the wood. I said, my eyes still on Melissa. Cuss with a voicemail from Dad. Why don't you tell me why? He opened his mouth. Closed it. Looked down at his lap. I caught the way Melissa's nails tapped once against her glass. Fuss with a voicemail from Dad, sharp and rhythmic, before she stopped. Kids, she said lightly. Such imaginations. The taste in my mouth was coppery, though I hadn't sipped. Buzz with a voicemail from Dad. My heart was doing that unsteady skip. Too fast, then a pause, then fast again. Years as a nurse had taught me to notice my own body's alarms. And right now, when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, every one of them was going off. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping against the tile with a sound that made Daniel flinch. When buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, I could feel the eyes of everyone around the table. But I didn't look at them. I kept my gaze on the juice. It looked harmless. Deep red. Festive? When buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. But I had learned long ago that danger rarely announces itself with a warning label. Melissa leaned back, her arm draped over the chair, the picture of ease. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. You're making a scene, Mom. Daniel muttered without meeting my eyes. I thought of the check I'd signed for their mortgage just 6 months ago. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The babysit and the meals, the Christmas gifts that had always been from Santa. So the kids would never know I'd paid for them. And now my own son couldn't even look at me. Seen or not, I said, standing. With a voicemail from Dad. I've lost my appetite. I picked up my plate and walked it to the counter. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. My hands didn't shake. Years in emergency rooms had trained me for steadiness under pressure, but inside I felt something crack, not loud, not messy. Abundance. Would I does made just a clean, quiet break. Behind me chairs scraped tape, conversations restarted in low murmurs. Someone laughed too loudly at nothing. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. I washed my hands at the sink, the water running warm over my fingers. I stared out the window into the dark yard. With a voicemail from Dad. Where the porch light caught the edge of the snow piling on the railing. My breath fogged the glass. Grandma. Ethan's small voice came from behind me. With a voicemail from Dad. I turned. He was alone. Melissa and Daniel were busy serving dessert to the others. His eyes darted to the counter where my untouched glass still sat. Muff from Dad. I heard them talking. He whispered. In the kitchen before dinner. What did you hear? Or my phone buzzed with a voice wave from Dad. Sweetheart, they said you'd be gone soon. The words landed heavy, but not in the way a threat does. This was colder, calculated. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Crouched down so we were eye to eye. Thank you for telling me. I said, touching his cheek. His skin was warm, safe. For now. I glanced back at the table, with a voicemail from Dad. The candlelight flickering over faces I'd known my whole life. Some looked the same. Some I barely recognized anymore. I straightened, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, feeling the weight of every year, every sacrifice, every choice that had led me here. And in that moment, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, one thought anchored itself so firmly I could feel it in my bones. They think I'm blind. I smiled, small, private, the kind that doesn't reach your eyes, with a voicemail from Dad, because they have no idea what I still have left. I stood at the sink longer than I needed to, the warm water soaking into my palms, with a voicemail from Dad. It was the same stance I'd had thousands of times before in kitchens that smelled of Sunday roasts or lemon soap. It took me back. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, back to the year we bought this house. The siding was peeling, the roof sagged on one side, and the plumbing rattled like an old man's cough. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, George had looked at me with that grin. The one that said he'd already pictured our lives here. And I'd said yes before I could think of the work ahead. When a phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, we're younger then. I was 32, still pulling double shifts at the hospital. Nights smelled of antiseptic and strong coffee. When voicemail from and days of sawdust and fresh paint. In George did the heavy lifting. I patched walls and made lists in my tidy nurse's handwriting. For my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Winters in those early years were cold enough to see your breath indoors before the furnace kicked in. We'd sit at the kitchen table in our coats, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad and wrapped around chip mugs of cocoa, laughing about how we'd fix everything. Next summer, we raised Daniel here. My phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. I can still see him on the back steps, sticky with popsicle juice, barefoot and grinning. He'd run through the yard chasing fireflies while I stood at the door, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The smell of fresh laundry tumbling from the dryer. I loved being a nurse. The long hours, the weight of other people's pain in my hands. It mattered. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Coming home to George, to Daniel, made the ache in my back and the soreness in my feet worth it. There was purpose on both sides of my life. When George got sick, Formio and buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, we fought it together. I still remember the afternoon we sat under the elm tree in the yard, the air thick with the scent of cut grass. He took my hand and said, my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. No matter what, keep the house. His voice was steady, but I could feel the tremor in his fingers. I promised. The years after he passed were quiet. With a voicemail from Dad. Too quiet some days. I kept working, took in renters for the upstairs apartment, and paid off every last bit of the mortgage. Daniel was in college by then. With a voicemail from Dad, I sent care packages, peanut butter, cookies, wool socks, the occasional $20 bill tucked inside a letter. When he married Melissa, with a voicemail from Dad, I welcomed her with open arms. I gave them the upstairs apartment rent-free so they could save for a place of their own. With a voicemail from Dad, Melissa thanked me with flowers and a handwritten card. I still have it tucked in a drawer, the ink faded but the sentiment sweet. It's strange, with a voicemail from Dad. How people change, how the small things pile up. The missed use, the sharp looks, the way your chair at the table shifts just a little farther away. With a voicemail from Dad one winter, maybe 3 years ago, Melissa suggested I move into a simpler place. Less to clean, she said, stirring sugar into her tea. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, I told her I liked my home just fine. Daniel didn't speak, just traced the rim of his mug with a finger. I brushed it off. Families have awkward moments. I was sipping my latte when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. I believe that. But lately, the warmth in this house doesn't reach me the way it used to. The air feels different, like a draft you can't find the source of. With a voicemail from Dad, even the creak of the floorboard sounds unfamiliar. I walked into the living room now, my hands dry from the sink. The couch was empty, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The hum of voices from the dining room, carrying down the hall. I sank into the armchair George used to claim. With a phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the fabric still faintly smelling of the cedar oil I rubbed into the wood frame every spring. I thought about Ethan, the urgency in his voice. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the way he'd looked over his shoulder before speaking. He's too young to be carrying secrets like that. I reached for the photo on the side table. George. When it buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, Daniel and me on the front porch, a summer afternoon years ago. The light was golden, Daniel's hair messy from mowing the lawn. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. George had his arm around us both. We looked like a family. I stared at that frozen moment until the voices in the dining room grew louder. My phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The clink of plates sharper, something in their tone made me set the photo down. They were talking about me. I couldn't make out every word. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, but I caught enough papers. Oh, timing! She'll sign. The warmth of my memories drained, replaced by a steady, with a voicemail from Dad, familiar calm I'd learned in trauma bays. The kind that comes when you know someone's life, maybe your own, is about to change. I stood with a voicemail from Dad, smoothing my skirt, and walked toward the sound. The sound of silverware on china was too loud for a Tuesday night. We weren't celebrating anything. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, just sharing a meal in the dining room because Melissa had something to discuss. Ethan sat beside me, quietly working through his green beans, with a voicemail from Dad. Daniel was at the head of the table, phone face down but close to his hand. Melissa, across from me, poured herself more wine. With a voicemail from Dad. I've been thinking. She began, her voice light in a way that made my stomach tighten. With a voicemail from Dad. About how much work it takes to keep this place up. I kept my fork steady. It's nothing I can't handle. She smiled, but her eyes stayed cool. With a voicemail from Dad, maybe. But you're not getting any younger, Margaret. And, well, it's starting to show. The words landed like a slap, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. My fork scraped against the plate. Ethan's hand paused halfway to his mouth. Daniel cleared his throat but didn't look at me. From Dad. She's just saying. I heard what she's saying. I interrupted, my voice low, steady. I managed just fine. Melissa leaned forward, with a voicemail from Dad. Elbows on the table. You shouldn't have to manage, though. You should be comfortable. Maybe somewhere with no stairs, no yard to worry about. Phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Safer for someone your age. Like I was already halfway gone. I thought of the mornings I still walked the beach before sunrise. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The way the cold air woke me sharper than any cup of coffee. I thought of the garden I tended myself, the roses that bloomed despite the salt in the air. I didn't need her version of, safe. Ethan shifted beside me. Grandma likes it here, he said quietly. Melissa's gaze flicked to him, with a voicemail from Dad, sharp enough to make him drop his eyes to his plate. Anyway, she went on, it's not like we're pushing you out. But when you do decide to, with a voicemail from Dad, I would be happy to help handle things. I knew what handle things meant. I'd seen the way she looked at my upstairs apartment. Tavidu, I buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The way Daniel had started asking more questions about my accounts. The air in the room felt heavy. The smell of garlic bread, once comforting. Voicemail Fred now clung too thickly in my throat. My appetite was gone. Excuse me, I said, pushing my chair back. My knees ached, but I moved without showing it. Paused with a voicemail from Dad. Years on my feet in hospital wards had taught me to mask discomfort. In the kitchen, I rinsed my plate under a stream of hot water. My hands stung from the heat, with a voicemail from Dad, but I let it burn. Behind me, their voices dropped to a murmur. I could make out only pieces. With a voicemail from Dad. Not going to be easy. Come around. I dried my hands slowly, the cotton towel rough against my skin. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. My mind drifted to George's voice under that elm tree telling me to keep the house. It was more than wood and nails. It was the life we'd built. The voicemail from Dad then appeared in the doorway, holding his empty plate. His face was tight, lips pressed together. You okay? He asked softly. I forced a smile. With a voicemail from Dad. Of course, he didn't believe me, but he didn't push. He just handed me the plate and went back to the table. I stayed where I was, leaning against the counter listening. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, Melissa's laugh floated into the kitchen, the same brittle laugh she'd used with her friends when gossiping about neighbors. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, I thought of all the little cuts over the past year, the unreturned calls, the forgotten invitations. With a voicemail from Dad, the way my birthday cake last spring had been store-bought and flavorless. Back then, I told myself it didn't matter. Tonight, I wasn't so sure. With a voicemail from Dad, the dining room grew quiet again. Chairs scraped. Daniel's footsteps came into the kitchen. He picked up his glass from the counter, avoiding my eyes. Dad, she means well, he said finally. I met his gaze. Do you? He blinked. What's that supposed to mean? It means. I said, my voice even. Smile from Dad? What, that you sat there and let her talk to me like that? He looked away, jaw tightening. From Dad? I don't want to fight. I thought of all the fights I'd stood beside him through. Schoolyard scraps, breakups. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The mess after his first job fell apart. I'd been in his corner every time. Neither do I said, when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. But I won't be spoken to like I'm a piece of furniture. He muttered something I couldn't catch and walked out, his shoulders stiff. I stayed in voicemail from Dad. I stayed in the kitchen long after the clatter of dishes stopped, staring at the dark window over the sink. My reflection stared back. Older, yes, with a voicemail from Dad. But not done, I reached up to the cupboard, pulling down the small box where I kept important papers. My fingers rested on the envelopes inside. Bank statements, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The deed documents that still had my name, and only my name. From the hallway came the sound of Melissa's voice, low but urgent. With a voicemail from Dad. She doesn't even realize that I closed the box and set it back, the wood of the cupboard door warm from my hand. They thought I was losing grip. With a voicemail from Dad. They thought I'd make it easy? I almost laughed. Because if tonight had taught me anything, it was this: the gloves were coming off. The next morning, with a voicemail from Dad, the phone rang before the sun was up. I was halfway through my first cup of coffee, the mug warm against my palms, with the smell. Voicemail from Dad of roasted beans cutting through the damp salt air drifting in from the ocean. It was Daniel. His voice was unusually brisk. Mom? Buzz with a voicemail from Dad. Melissa and I were thinking, why don't we meet at the bank today? There are some things we should straighten out. Straighten out? I asked, watching steam curl up from my cups. Simplifying, when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Just to make sure everything's in order. I'd worked long enough around patients and families to know when someone was trying to sound casual and failing. Further, my stomach tightened. What kind of paperwork? I asked. You'll see, he said like it was nothing. 1 o'clock. I didn't agree. When my phone buzzed with mail from Dad, I just said I'd think about it and hung up. For the rest of the morning, I moved through my routine. Watering the plants, folding laundry, rinsing dishes. But my mind kept circling back, simplifying. Paperwork. Bank, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. It didn't take much imagination to picture Melissa leaning over Daniel's shoulder, whispering about making things easier. By noon, my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. I'd made my decision. If they wanted to talk about my finances, they could do it in my kitchen, with my coffee on my terms. When they arrived, with a voicemail from Dad, Melissa carried a manila folder. She put it on the table like she was setting down a gift. We've been looking at ways to streamline things, she began. Got her sliding the folder toward me. Daniel sat beside her, avoiding my eyes. I opened the folder. Inside was a stack of forms, transfer of joint tenancy, with a voicemail from Dad, power of attorney, beneficiary changes. My name was there, in print, followed by blank lines waiting for my signature. I don't need these, I said. Then my voice flat. Melissa tilted her head. It's just smart planning, Margaret. In cases something happens. Something like what? I asked. She smiled faintly. You never know. Accidents. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. It would give us the ability to take care of everything without bothering you. I set the papers down. With a voicemail from Dad. Bothering me is part of the job when you're family. Daniel finally spoke. We're just trying to help. I looked at him. I'm buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Then help me understand why these forms put both of your names on my accounts. Silence. Melissa's smile didn't move, but her eyes hardened. With a voicemail from Dad, I pushed the folder back toward them. No. Melissa leaned forward, her perfume too sweet, cloying. Margaret, we've done the math. Managing the house. Well, my phone's with a voicemail from Dad. Your bills, it's a lot. If you sign these, we can sell the upstairs apartment, pay off some debts, invest. Debts? I cut in. With a voicemail from Dad. Daniel's jaw tightened. We've had some setbacks. That was when the pieces clicked. This wasn't about helping me. It was about saving themselves. With hum buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. I stood, walked to the counter, and pulled my own folder from the drawer. It held my latest bank statement. I flipped it open, scanning the numbers. With a voicemail from Dad. Then I saw it, a withdrawal I didn't make, $5,000. Gone. I turned, holding the statement out. Explain this. Daniel's face flushed. From Dad? It's temporary. We need it. You took it. Melissa's voice sharpened. We'll pay it back, but if you just sign. I laughed once. When buffed with it a voicemail from Dad, without humor, you think stealing from me is the way to convince me to hand you everything. The kitchen felt smaller, the air thick. Outside, when I'm buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, gulls cried over the water, their calls sharp against the silence between us. Daniel stood. We're not stealing. From Dad, we're protecting your own interests, I said. Ethan's voice came from the doorway. Dad? Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, why don't you just leave Grandma's stuff alone? Melissa's head whipped toward him. Ethan, stay out of this. He didn't move. From Dad. I heard you talking last night. About selling the house. Melissa's lips thinned. Daniel took a step toward him, but I stepped in between. When buzzed with a voicemail from Leanne, my hand rested lightly on Ethan's shoulder. You've said enough, sweetheart. I told him softly, then looked back at Daniel and Melissa. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. You both should go. Melissa gathered the papers slowly, as if dragging the moment out. You're making a mistake, she said. I held her gaze. No. With a voicemail from Dad, I'm stopping one. They left without another word. The sound of the door closing echoed through the house. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. I stood in the kitchen a long while after they were gone, staring at the folder still in my hand. 5,000 gone without my consent. Formally when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. And if they were desperate enough to take that, there was no telling what they'd try next. I poured myself another cup of coffee, the bitter taste settling me. With a voicemail from Dad. They thought they'd shaken me. But all they'd done was confirm what I already knew. I needed to be ready. And I would be. The house had never felt so quiet. Foreman buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Not the peaceful kind of quiet that used to fill these rooms when George was still here reading in his chair while I put her around the kitchen. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. This was the hollow kind, the kind where every sound, the tick of the clock, the creak of the floor, felt like a reminder that you were alone. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, even when other people were under the same roof. For 3 days after the bank confrontation, Daniel avoided me entirely. If he was home, with a voicemail from Dad. He stayed upstairs with Melissa, the muffled sound of the TV leaking down the hall. When we did cross paths, he'd offer a clipped, "Hi." Melissa mail from Dad, Mom. Before disappearing, Melissa didn't even bother with that much. The dining table became a dividing line. If I sat at one end, they sat at the other. For meals were rushed, conversation polite but empty. The only real words came from Ethan. Tone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, who'd slip in small updates about school or the latest video game he was playing. I could tell he was trying to fill the silence. On Thursday, I found the family calendar on the fridge with a voicemail from Dad. My name had been scratched out from Saturday, Harbor Festival. I'd gone every year since moving to Gloucester, working the hospital's charity booth. A phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, chatting with neighbors. It wasn't just tradition, it was my community. Now it seemed I wasn't part of the plan. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Melissa came into the kitchen while I was still staring at the calendar. "Oh, that," she said, waving a hand. "We figured it might be too much for you." From Dad? "Long day? Lots of walking." "I've managed before," I said. Her smile was thin. "Well, we just thought you'd be more comfortable here." "Here!" My phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad alone. Out of sight. The smell of her perfume lingered after she left, too sweet, clinging in the air like something artificial trying to cover something rotten. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Later that afternoon, I sat on the porch, the salt wind tugging at my cardigan. The gulls were noisy overhead, diving for scraps near the harbor. Watched with a voicemail from Dad. I watched Ethan walking up the street, a paper bag in his hands. He plopped down beside me, grinning. "Brought you something," he said, with a voicemail from Dad, pulling out a blueberry muffin from the bakery downtown. Still warm, the smell alone softened something tight in my chest. A voicemail from Dad. "Thought you were going to the festival," I said. He shrugged. "Didn't feel like it." We sat in comfortable silence for a while. When I phoned us with a voice from Dad, the kind I used to have with George, I caught myself wondering if Ethan knew just how much these small gestures meant. Probably not. At his age, what if you don't? My phone buzzes with a voicemail, you don't realize the weight of them. That night I heard voices drifting down from upstairs. Daniel's was low, Melissa's sharper. When I buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, "She's stubborn, won't sign, embarrassing if she..." The rest was too muffled, but I didn't need the full script. They were planning something. Ford was sipping my other when a voicemail from Dad. I could feel it in the way Melissa's tone curled at the edges in the pauses where Daniel didn't disagree. The next morning, I found a printed invitation on the counter with a voicemail from Dad. Community appreciation dinner hosted at the Harborview Hall. Melissa's name was listed as one of the organizers. With a voicemail from Dad, I knew the place. It was where the town held fundraisers, weddings, retirement parties. A big crowd, lots of eyes. When I asked about it, Melissa said casually, "Mail from Dad." "Oh, it's just a small thing. You should come. Might be nice for you to get out." Her voice was honey, but I heard the iron underneath. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. That's when I realized whatever she was planning, it would happen there. Public, polished. A way to make me look like I didn't belong anymore. I smiled back, with a voicemail from Dad, hiding the way my stomach nodded. Of course, I said. Wouldn't miss it. Because if she wanted to put me on display, with a voicemail from Dad, she was forgetting one thing. I knew how to stand under bright lights without flinching. The Harborview Hall glittered under a wash of golden light, with a voicemail from Dad, its big window spilling warmth into the cold night air. I stood just inside the entrance, my coat draped over my arm, taking in the room. Linen, draped tables. With a voicemail from Dad, crystal glasses catching the glow of the chandeliers. The smell of roast beef and rosemary floated above the low hum of conversation. Melissa spotted me first. With a buzzwhiff of the voicemail from Dad, she was in a sleek navy dress, hair swept up, the picture of a gracious hostess. She crossed the room with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Margaret. Fei Sheng, from Dad. You made it. She sent air kissing my cheek. Her perfume was strong, floral with a bite underneath. Come, sit up front. I saved you a seat. Up front. With a voicemail from Dad, center stage. Exactly where she wanted me. I followed her, weaving through clusters of townsfolk, each table alive with chatter and clinking silverware. With a voicemail from Dad. People nodded politely, some offering warm greetings, others glancing past me toward Melissa. My heels clicked softly on the polished wood floor. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the seat she'd chosen was directly in line with the podium, no escape without drawing attention. Daniel was already seated, his tie slightly askew, with a voicemail from Dad. He gave me a small nod, then busied himself with his water glass. Ethan, 2 seats away, caught my eye and mouthed, "You okay?" I gave him a reassuring smile I didn't entirely feel. Dinner began. Plates of roast beef, garlic mashed potatoes, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, and green beans almondine appeared, carried by young volunteers. The food smelled rich, but my appetite was thin. I kept my hands busy with my napkin. One of them buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, folding and refolding it. Midway through the meal, Melissa stepped to the podium. She tapped the microphone, the soft thump pulling all eyes toward her. From Dad. Good evening, everyone. She began, voice smooth. The buzz with a voicemail from Dad. Thank you for joining us to celebrate the contributions of so many in our community. I sipped my water, waiting for the turn, with a voicemail from Dad. It came faster than I expected. I'd like to take a moment to recognize someone very dear to us. With a voicemail from Dad, she's been a fixture in this town for decades. Melissa's smile widened. But as with all things, there comes a time for change. With a voicemail from Dad, a time to pass the torch. There were polite chuckles from the crowd. My grip on the glass tightened. From Dad, she's stepping back from her responsibilities. Melissa continued, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. And we think it's important to honor her for everything she's done before she enjoys a well-deserved rest. Stepping back, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. This was the first I'd heard of it. Melissa gestured toward me. Margaret Hale, would you join me up here? The room applauded. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. All those familiar faces, neighbors, former patients, people I'd served beside at fundraisers, smiling without knowing what they were smiling at. With a voicemail from Dad, I walked to the podium, each step measured. Melissa handed me a plaque, shiny and engraved. For years of service, it read, with a voicemail from Dad. With gratitude from the community. A retirement plaque I hadn't asked for. The photographer from the local paper leaned in, camera flashing. With a voicemail from Dad, Melissa slipped an arm around my waist for the photo, her nails pressing lightly through the fabric of my dress. Would a phone buzz with a voicemail from Dad? Would you like to say a few words? She asked sweetly into the microphone. I looked at the crowd. My voice was steady when I spoke. With a voicemail from Dad? I wasn't aware I'd stepped back from anything, but I thank you for the surprise. A few puzzled murmurs rippled through the room. With a voicemail from Dad. Melissa's smile fond enough for me to see it. I suppose? I continued that, when people think they know what's best for you, when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, they'll go to great lengths to make it happen. I let my gaze rest on her for a beat before turning back to the audience. I'm still here. Still able. One buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, and I'll decide when it's time for me to stop. The room was quiet for half a second before polite applause broke out. Some faces looked awkward now. Feet Rafford uncertain. Melissa laughed lightly into the mic, trying to smooth it over. Always humble, she said, with a voicemail from Dad. We just wanted to make sure you knew you're appreciated. I stepped back from the podium, holding the plaque loosely at my side. As I returned to my seat, with a voicemail from Dad, Ethan's eyes were bright, a mix of pride and worry. Dinner resumed, but the atmosphere had shifted. Conversations felt more guarded. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, I noticed Melissa at the far end of the table, speaking low to Daniel, her jaw tight. Every now and then she glanced my way, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. When dessert came, a triple chocolate cake, I found an envelope tucked under my plate. No name, just a single sheet inside. A photocopy of my deed. Forward my phone, there's voicemail from Dad. The upstairs apartment circled in red. I folded it and slipped it into my purse without a word. Whoever had put it there knew something. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Maybe they wanted me to know it too. I sipped my coffee, the bitterness grounding me. The plaque sat on the table beside my plate. Juan buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, catching the light like a trophy from a game I hadn't played. Across the room, Melissa was laughing with a cluster of people, her back to me. By phone with a voicemail from Dad. But I could feel the tension in her shoulders even from here. She thought she'd humiliated me tonight. All she'd done was confirm what I suspected was moving a voicemail from Dad. She was moving faster than I'd imagined. And now I had proof that my house, was in her sights. The morning after the dinner, with a voicemail from Dad. I sat at the kitchen table with the deed spread out before me. The copy from last night was crisp. Voicemail from Dad. The red circle around the upstairs apartment looking almost like lipstick. I ran my fingers over the paper, with a voicemail from Dad, feeling the raised edge where the toner had been thick. George's voice echoed in my head from years ago under the elm tree. With a voicemail from Dad. Keep the house. Not part of it, not the downstairs, the house. I pulled the small lockbox from the pantry shelf and set it beside my coffee. Bus with a voicemail from Dad. The key was on my ring tucked behind the one for the shed. The lock gave a soft click, and I lifted the lid. Inside were manila envelopes, each labeled in my handwriting. Mortgage paid, taxes filed, insurance active. When Vove buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, I took out the folder marked property and laid the original deed next to the copy. My name stood alone in bold type on the original. The copy, with a voicemail from Dad, a new line underneath, Melissa Hale, typed in the same font, smaller, as if it had been squeezed in. My stomach tightened. This wasn't just talk. Voicemail from Dad. She'd already tried to put her name on my home. By 9, I was at the bank. The air inside was cool, with a voicemail from Dad, carrying the faint scent of printer toner and polished wood. Behind the counter, with a voicemail from Dad. The same young woman who'd opened Ethan's savings account last summer looked up with a polite smile. Morning, Mrs. Hale. With a voicemail from Dad. I'd like to review my accounts. All of them. And I'll need copies of any changes made in the past year. She nodded. A voicemail from Dad, typing quickly. One moment. The wait felt longer than it was. I studied the framed photos on the wall. Sepia shots of the harbor, the lighthouse. With a voicemail from Dad. Fishing boats from another era. This bank had been part of my life since George and I opened our first joint account here. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Now I wasn't sure I trusted the floor beneath me. The woman returned with a folder and gestured toward a small office. You can review them here. Inside, with a voicemail from Dad, I spread the documents across the desk. Most were exactly as I'd left them. With a voicemail from Dad, but then I saw the my checking account, where an authorized signatory had been added. Melissa Hale. When Mize would a voicemail from Dad, the date next to her name was 3 months ago. I felt my pulse in my throat. Who authorized this? I asked. She scanned the page. Luz with a voicemail from Dad. I would have required your signature. I didn't sign anything. Her brow furrowed. If you'd like, from that we can pull the original paperwork. Yes, I said. Please do. 10 minutes later, she returned with a scanned copy. There was my name, my address, when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, and at the bottom a signature that looked like mine, but wasn't. The loops in the M were too tight, the line of the H just slightly off. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Good enough to fool someone who didn't know my handwriting as well as I did. I sat back, the office chair creaking, when buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. My hands felt cold despite the steady hum of the heater. Whoever had submitted this knew exactly what they were doing. From Dad. Would you like me to flag this for fraud? She asked gently. Not yet, I said. Print me a copy. Voicemail Dad, and don't tell anyone I was here. Her eyes flickered with understanding. Of course. I left with the folder tucked under my arm, with a voicemail from Dad. The winter air biting at my cheeks. The sky over the harbor was heavy with gray gulls wheeling low. I stopped by the post office next. As well as a voicemail from Dad, inside my box was a thick envelope from the county clerk's office. My heart gave a hard thump. At home, I tore it open. A voicemail from Dad, it said a notice of intent to transfer title. Dated last week, the recipient listed was me. The requester, Melissa Hale, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. No wonder she'd been so confident. I sat at the table spreading the bank documents and the notice side by side. She'd gone beyond talk and maneuvering, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. She'd made a move to legally take what George had left me. Ethan came in from school as I was still staring at the papers. He dropped his backpack by the door. From Dad? You're frowning, he said. I forced a smile. Just thinking. He came over, looking at the table, his eyes widened. With a voicemail. Tevlay from Dad, is that about the house? I hesitated, then nodded. Your parents are trying to change some things. He bit his lip. With a voicemail from Dad. I heard Mom on the phone yesterday. She said something about getting it done before she notices. I think she meant you. I reached over. With a voicemail from Dad squeezing his hand. Thank you for telling me. He pulled something from his pocket. A crumpled receipt from the bank. I found this in the trash upstairs. With a voicemail from Dad. It's for a notary. I took it, smoothing it out. The notary's name was familiar. He'd witnessed the sale of George's fishing boat years ago. With a voicemail from Dad, my chest tightened. If Melissa had gone to him, she was close to finalizing whatever she'd started. With a voicemail from Dad, I slid the receipt into the folder with the rest of my evidence. Every piece made the picture sharper. That night, with a voicemail from Dad, I lay awake listening to the wind rattle the old windows. In the dark, I could see George's face as clear as if he were beside me. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, he'd trusted me to keep this place safe. And I would. Melissa thought I was cornered. She thought she covered her tracks well enough to win. With a voicemail from Dad. But now I had proof. Sleep didn't come easy that night. I lay staring at the faint glow of the street lamp filtering through the blinds. With a voicemail from Dad. Listening to the wind calm through the bare branches outside. The house had a different voice in the dark, the occasional sigh of the old wood. With a voicemail from Dad. The gentle tick of the baseboard heater. Normally those sounds lulled me. Not now. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that red circle on the deed copy. With a voicemail from Dad. Oh, it was hey, fine done. I saw Melissa's name where it didn't belong, typed neatly beneath mine like she'd earned her place. I saw the notary receipt, the forged signature. With a voicemail from Dad. The county clerk's notice. Each image flickered behind my eyelids like slides in a lecture I hadn't asked to attend. At 2 in the morning, when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, I gave up pretending to sleep. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my feet finding the worn rug George and I had picked up in Portland. The air was cool. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, smelling faintly of cedar from the chest at the foot of the bed. I padded to the kitchen, filling the kettle and setting it on the stove, with a voicemail from Dad. The quiet whistle when it boiled was almost comforting. I poured hot water over chamomile, watching the steam twist upward, my breath mingling with it. Roja buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Sitting at the table, I spread out the folder again. Every piece of paper felt heavier in my hands tonight. I traced the edges of the bank form with my thumb. With a voicemail from Dad. Memorizing the flaws in the fake signature, I imagined Melissa leaning over a counter, telling some clerk she had my permission. Voicemail from Dad, I imagined Daniel standing behind her silent. The anger came slow like a tide turning. With a voicemail from Dad, I wasn't a woman prone to rage. Nursing teaches you to channel emotion into focus. But this was a betrayal with precision. Voicemail from Dad and precision deserved a measured response. I opened my laptop and began a list. Not of revenge, not yet. Of facts. Dates of changes to my accounts. My phone buzzed with a voicemail from names on the documents, addresses of offices, the notary's contact information, the county clerk's file number. I typed until my fingers cramped. By 4, voicemail from Dad, I had a planned skeleton. Quiet steps, each one hard to trace back to me. My years at the hospital had taught me to keep meticulous records. Now, with a voicemail from Dad, those habits would be my shield. I tucked the folder back into the lockbox and slid it behind the bags of flour in the pantry. No one but me ever baked anymore. What was a slave? The voicemail from Dad. The safe there, the dawn seeped into the kitchen, soft and gray. I sipped the last of my tea, the chamomile gone bitter from sitting too long. My body was tired, but my mind was sharp. I thought of George again. How he used to say, from Dad. The calm before the storm is when you check your sails. At 7, Ethan shuffled in, rubbing his eyes. "You're up early," he said. "Would a voicemail from Dad?" "Didn't sleep," I replied, forcing a smile. "Thought I'd get a head start on the day." He poured himself cereal, with a voicemail from Dad. The smell of toasted oats filling the air. "You're not going to let them take it, are you?" I looked at him. The voicemail from Dad really looked. This boy caught between loyalty to his parents and his instinct for what was right. "No," I said, "I'm not." After he left for school, with a voicemail from Dad, I made my first call. Not to a lawyer, not yet. To an old friend from the hospital, Carol, who'd retired to work part-time at the county records office. Menthon Goffer, we hadn't spoken in months, but she picked up on the second ring. "Margaret, it's been ages." "I need to see you," I said quietly. "Mail from Dad, and I need you to keep it between us." Her tone shifted. "You have something specific in mind?" "Yes. When I buzzed with the voicemail from Dad, I think someone's trying to change the title on my property without my consent." She exhaled slowly. "Come by after lunch. For use the side door." I thanked her and hung up, my pulse steady. One step. Next was with a voicemail from Dad. I pulled out my old address book and flipped to a name I hadn't called in years. Jack Rourke, retired detective. He'd been a patient once. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Recovering from knee surgery. We'd spent hours talking about small-town politics and the ways people thought they could get away with things. When he answered, his voice was gruff from Dad. His voice was gruff but warm. "Well, if it isn't Nurse Hale. To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I've got a situation," I said, with a voicemail from Dad. "And I think you're the man to help me figure out how deep it goes. Meet me at the diner at 10. He said without hesitation. I hung up, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, feeling the first flicker of control return. At the diner, the air smelled of bacon and strong coffee. Jack slid into the booth across from me, when a voicemail from Dad, his leather jacket creaking. I laid out the facts, pushing the forged form toward him. He studied it, then whistled low. "That's good work."
Not yours, I mean.
With a voicemail from Dad. "Whoever did this new enough to make it look casual? Can you find out if she's done this before?" I asked. He nodded. "I'll poke around." My phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Quietly. Back home, I felt the exhaustion settle in my bones, but I wouldn't let myself rest. I needed to be ready for whatever came next. With a voicemail from Dad, Melissa wasn't going to slow down. She'd proven that. If I hesitated, I'd lose everything. That night, lying in bed again, I stared at the ceiling. When buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the house creaked, the wind rattled the old glass, and somewhere in the dark, I felt George beside me, steady and certain. I whispered into the quiet, watched my phone buzz with a voicemail from Dad. By Monday morning, my plan was no longer just a skeleton. It had bones, muscle, and the quiet pulse of something alive. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, I started with the most vulnerable point, the accounts. After breakfast, when Daniel and Melissa were both out, when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, I drove to the credit union on the other side of town, the one they'd forgotten I used for smaller savings. I met with a manager I'd known for years. When my phone buzzes with a voicemail from Dad, a woman named Jean who'd once sat beside me at a PTA meeting when Ethan was in kindergarten. "I need to move some funds," I said. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, and I need the process to be completely discreet. Jean's brow lifted, but she didn't ask questions. Within half an hour, my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. I had transferred a substantial portion of my accessible savings into a new account under my maiden name, complete with a separate mailing address.
A P.O.
When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, box I'd opened that morning, the balance left in the old account was enough to seem ordinary, nothing to raise suspicion. Next came the property. After lunch, with a voicemail from Dad, I kept my appointment with Carol at the county records office. She met me at the side door, her cardigan pulled tight against the wind. Inside, with a voicemail from Dad, she led me to a cramped office lined with filing cabinets. "I pulled your file," she said, sliding a manila folder across the desk. "From Dad. Here's the current title, and here's the transfer request." I opened the second document. Melissa's name was there, typed neatly under mine. Requester line filled out in her careful print. But the signature, the forgery again. "Has this been processed?" I asked. "Dad." "Not yet," Carol said. "It's scheduled for review in 2 weeks." 2 weeks. That was the window. Praman buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. I took out a notarized statement I'd prepared over the weekend, declaring the transfer request fraudulent and unauthorized. Carol slid it into the file. With a voicemail from Dad, stamping it with the date. This will flag the request, she said. It won't move forward unless you approve. Relief was a quiet thing. Phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, but through me. Thank you. Leaving the office, I stopped by the hardware store. The clerk cut me 2 new house keys, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, which I slipped into my pocket along with a small brass lock for the upstairs door. With him that's buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, Melissa wouldn't notice right away. She rarely went up there. But when she did, it would be too late. That evening, Cowan buzzed with a voicemail from Dad and invited Ethan to help me, or reorganize, the upstairs apartment. We boxed up anything personal, tucking it into the locked storage room at the back. Why are we doing this? He asked. Because sometimes, I said, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. You don't let people know what you've got until you're ready for them to see it. By midweek, I'd met with Jack again at the diner. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, he slid a small notebook across the table. Your daughter-in-law's been busy, said, 2 months ago. To the voicemail from Dad, she tried to access us a safe deposit box at the Nernank. Didn't get in, but she was asking questions. What's in that box? He asked. From Dad. Documents George left me, I said, and a few things she'd love to get her hands on. Better check it? He advised. The next morning I did. Buzz was with a voicemail from Dad. Everything was still there. The original deed, George's will, even the letter he'd written me the year before he died, with a voicemail from Dad urging me to keep the home in the family but only in hands that respect it. I tucked that letter into my lockbox at home. It wasn't just paper. A voice that about provide for them from Dad that was me musing on Friday, I set the final part of my plan in motion. I called an old colleague from the hospital who now worked at a legal aid clinic. With a voicemail from Dad. We met in her office, where the air smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and the radiator clanked in the corner. From Dad. Need to draft a revocation of any and all powers of attorney, real or implied. I said. From Dad. And I want a will that leaves everything to Ethan. She blinked. That's decisive. It's necessary. By the time I left, my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The papers were signed and witnessed. They wouldn't be filed publicly yet. I'd keep them in my control until the moment was right, when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. But knowing they existed made my shoulders feel lighter. That night, the house felt different. Melissa and Daniel chatted in the living room, their voices low. My phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. I didn't care to hear the details. I was upstairs, locking the last of the storage room boxes. My plan wasn't complete, but the pieces were in place, with a voicemail from Dad. And if Melissa thought I was still cornered, well, she'd find out soon enough. When my them buzzed with a voice from Dad, for the day I chose for the cutoff was a Friday. The same day Melissa had scheduled another family meeting. She'd sent the text earlier in the week saying, phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Let's clear the air 5 p.m. in the living room. No details, no explanation. It had the same tone as the dinner invitation, all sugar on the surface, perfect. My phone was with a voicemail from Dad. By mid-morning, I'd already made my rounds. First stop was the bank where Jen helped me move the last of my funds into the account under my maiden name. My phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The remaining balance, just enough to keep the account open. Wouldn't get them far. From there, I went to the county records office, where funder buzzed with a voicemail from where Carol slid me a stamped confirmation that the fraudulent title transfer was blocked pending investigation. Then came the legal aid office. Formerly, my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. My attorney printed the final copies of the revocation documents and the updated will, sealing them in an envelope for safekeeping. With a voicemail from Dad, I slipped it to my purse next to George's letter. At home, the winter light was already fading. The gulls were circling low over the harbor. There cries with a voicemail from Gens. I brewed. Sure against the wind, I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, strong black, and set 3 mugs on the table. Let them think it was hospitality. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, they arrived together, Melissa in a red sweater, Daniel in a navy blazer he hadn't worn since Easter. Ethan trailed behind, hands shoved deep in his pockets. From Dad. His eyes flicked to me, questioning. Thanks for coming. Melissa said as they settled. She glanced at Daniel, then began. We've all had tensions lately. What buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, but this doesn't have to be hard. We just need to formalize some things for everyone's benefit. I folded my hands on the table. Voicemail from Dad. Go on. Daniel slid a document across to me. This is a shared ownership agreement. It names all of us on the house. That way, voicemail Dad, if anything happens to you, you can sell it without asking me. I finished. My voice was calm. Melissa's smile froze. With a voicemail from Dad, that's not how I'd put it. I pushed the paper back toward them. I won't sign. She leaned forward, perfume sharp in the warm air. Margaret, buzz with a voicemail from Dad. This is the smart move. You're 73. You shouldn't have to manage all this alone. I'm not alone, I said, glancing at Ethan. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Daniel's jaw tightened. We're offering you security. I reached into my purse, pulling out the bank statement with Melissa's forged signature. Voicemail from Dad. You call this security? I slid it across the table. Melissa's eyes flickered. That's out of context. And this... I laid down the county's notice of intent to transfer title. Bush with a voicemail from Dad. Alzilla rose in her cheeks. Daniel shifted in his chair. Mom, you're making this adversarial? No? I said you are. With a voicemail from Dad. You made it adversarial the moment you forged my name. Melissa opened her mouth, but I held up a hand. With a voicemail from Dad. I've already revoked any authority either of you thought you had. Legally, you have no access to my accounts, my property. You can't just... Daniel began. I can, I said. And I have. From my purse came the final envelope, with a voicemail from Dad. I broke the seal and pulled out the updated will. I've left everything to Ethan. Effective immediately. Ethan's eyes widened. From Dad, his mouth opening in shock, Grandma. This is not about favoritism, I said, meeting his gaze. With a voicemail from Dad. It's about trust. Melissa's chair scraped the floor as she stood. You'll regret this? I rose too, my voice still steady. No, Melissa. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. You will. Because I've also filed a fraud report with the bank and the county. They'll be contacting you. Her mouth opened, then shut again. When he buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, Daniel's face had gone pale. The room was quiet except for the ticking clock. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, I think we're done here, I said. Melissa grabbed her coat, Daniel trailing after her. At the doorway, she turned, with a voicemail from Dad. You've made an enemy. I met her stare. I've made a boundary. The door shut behind them, the sound final. Ethan stood frozen. Did you mean it? With a voicemail from Dad. About everything to me? Yes, I said simply. Because you've done what no one else here has. You've been honest. He swallowed hard. With a voicemail from Dad, then nodded. I won't let you down. Later alone in the kitchen, I poured the last of the coffee into my cup. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the air still smelled faintly of Melissa's perfume, but beneath it was something stronger. The cedar from George's letter, tucked safe in the lockbox. Looping my light when my phone the buzzed voicemail from Dad. For the first time in months, I felt the house breathe with me again. The first call came Monday morning. I was in the kitchen, buttering toast, with a voicemail from Dad. When the phone rang, the bank's number flashed on the screen. Jean's voice was brisk but not unkind. Mrs. Hale, with a voicemail from Dad. We've reviewed the documents you submitted. The signature on the account change is confirmed as fraudulent. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. We'll be removing the unauthorized signatory immediately. I thanked her, feeling a slow satisfaction rise, when buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The butter on my toast melted into the bread as I hung up untouched. The house felt warmer somehow, though the February wind rattled against the windows. My phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. By noon, Carol called from the county clerk's office. The transfer request is officially blocked, she said. It's on record as contested. From Dan, the file is flagged for potential fraud. Thank you, Carol, I said, for everything. That afternoon, Daniel showed up alone. No Melissa. With it a voicemail from Dad. His hands were shoved deep in his jacket pockets, his face drawn. Mom, he began, standing awkwardly in the doorway. They called us. About everything. I let him in but didn't offer coffee. Then you know why I did what I did? He sank into a chair. Tough. Melissa says you've ruined us? No, I said. Melissa's choices did that. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, I just refused to let her ruin me too. He rubbed a hand over his face. I didn't sign anything. I didn't even know. You knew enough. Knew enough. I cut in. Word with a voicemail from Dad, my voice soft but firm. You stood by while she tried to take my home. For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. Finally, he stood. For no, Dad, I don't know if we can fix this. Maybe not, I said. But that's not all on me. When he left, the air in the house felt lighter. Overdid honest. Over the next week, word spread. Gloucester was a small town, nothing stayed secret long. At the grocery store, with a voicemail from Dad. I caught the looks, some sympathetic, others curious. A few friends stopped me in the aisles, lowering their voices. One phoned Buscodom and heard you stood your ground. One neighbor said, good for you. In the evenings, Ethan came by more often. Sometimes we played cards. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, other nights we just sat on the porch with mugs of cocoa, the harbor lights flickering in the distance. He didn't talk much about his parents, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, and I didn't ask. It was enough that he was here. One evening, as we watched the gulls wheel over the water, he said quietly, with a voicemail from Dad, I think they're going to sell the condo. They need the money. I nodded. For them, Dad? That's their choice. You're not angry? Anger's a waste, I said. I've got my home. I've got peace. J.H. morning my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. That's more than most. The days grew a little longer, the air a little softer with the promise of spring. I started tending the garden again. With a voicemail from Dad, my hands deep in the dark soil, the smell rich and grounding, I planted crocuses along the walkway. Buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, a small act of defiance against the winter that had settled over this family. Melissa didn't call. Not once. Daniel sent a short text on my birthday, with a voicemail from Dad. Hope you're well. I replied with 2 words I am. By the end of the month, the legal matters were tied off. The bank confirmed all accounts were secure. The county filed my statement permanently, with a voicemail from Dad. Jack dropped by with one last update. Melissa's attempt to access my safe deposit box had been quietly added to the bank's internal watch list, with a voicemail from Dad. She won't get near it again, he said. When he left, I stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking out at the street. With a voicemail from Dad, the wind carried the faint scent of salt and something sweeter, maybe the neighbor's early daffodils. For the first time in a long while, when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, I felt something like peace settle in. Not the fragile kind that could be taken away with a knock at the door, but the steady kind you build for yourself. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad's where spring came early that year, by late March, the crocuses along my walkway had opened into bright purple cups, their petals trembling in the harbor breeze. With a voicemail from Dad, the air was warmer, smelling faintly of salt and earth, and the gulls' cries no longer sounded sharp. They sounded like home. My phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. I'd started spending my mornings in the upstairs apartment again, the one Melissa had circled on that forged deed. Sunlight streamed through the east windows. I'm sipping my landlord buzz with a voicemail from the pooling on the hardwood floor where George's old desk sat. I'd cleared the boxes Ethan and I had stored here, with a voicemail from Dad, replacing them with shelves I'd found at a thrift shop and a scattering of armchairs I'd reupholstered myself. It wasn't an apartment anymore. Buzz with a voicemail from Dad. It was a library, my library. The idea had come to me during one of those sleepless nights in the thick of it all. A place for neighbors, friends, Membuzz with a voicemail from Dad, anyone who wanted a quiet corner and a good book, something to keep me connected to the town on my own terms. On the first Saturday in April, when fun buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, I opened the door to the public. Ethan stood beside me, holding a plate of blueberry muffins we'd baked that morning. The smell drifted down the hall when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, the mixing with the scent of coffee brewing in the little kitchenette. The first visitors were 2 kids from the next street over, their eyes wide at the shelves. My phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. Then came Mrs. Temple from the post office, carrying a stack of mysteries to donate. By noon, the place hummed with soft conversation and the rustle of pages. I was sipping in my landward fence with a voicemail from Dad. It wasn't Granny, it was mine. In the afternoons, when the library was quiet, I'd sit by the window with a cup of tea, with a voicemail from Dad watching the harbor. Sometimes Ethan would drop by after school, buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, slinging his backpack onto the chair and collapsing beside me with homework spread out between us. He didn't talk about his parents much anymore. My phone that buzzed with a voicemail from Dad and I didn't push. Our bond didn't need words to feel real. One day in May, Daniel came by. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before stepping inside. Dad had his hands shoved deep in his pockets. This is nice, he said, glancing around. Thank you, I replied. My voice was even, with a voicemail from Dad. I wanted to say I'm sorry for not stopping her, for letting it get that far. I met his eyes. I hope you mean that. I do, he said quietly, with a voicemail from Dad. And I'm glad you didn't lose this place. He left not long after, but it was enough, not forgiveness, not yet, but a crack in the wall. By summer, I felt my buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. The library had a small circle of regulars, retirees, a few teens who wanted somewhere quiet to work, even the harbor master who liked to read over lunch. The buzz was with a voicing Dad. I'd started hosting a monthly story hour, reading aloud from old local history books and memoirs. People listened, laughed, with a voicemail from Dad, and sometimes shared their own memories. It was healing in a way I hadn't expected. Not just for me, but for anyone who'd ever felt pushed aside. With a voicemail from Dad. One evening in July, after the last visitor left, I locked up and sat on the porch with Ethan. The sunset washed the harbor in gold, the water rippling like silk. "Dad, you're different now," he said suddenly. "How so?" I asked. "You're lighter." "Happier," I smiled, with a voicemail from Dad. "That's what happens when you stop letting people take pieces of you." He nodded, his gaze on the water. I want to be like that." "You will?" I said. "Because you already know where your boundaries are?" We sat in silence until the sky went dark, with a voicemail from Dad. The first stars winking above the harbor. When I finally went inside, I paused at the bottom of the stairs, looking up toward the library. Phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad. It wasn't just a room full of books. It was proof that you could stand your ground, that you could rebuild. When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, that you could turn a place someone tried to steal into the heart of your life. George would have liked that. I locked the door, feeling the key warm in my hand. And the bottomless voicemail from my home, my space, my choice, and I knew, without question, that the years ahead were mine to shape, and no one else's. Before we close this chapter, with a voicemail from Dad, let me ask you something. What would you do if someone you loved, someone you trusted, tried to take everything you'd built? With a voicemail from Dad. Would you fight quietly like I did, piece by piece until you won? Would you confront them in front of everyone? Or would you walk away, start fresh? When my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad and leave them to their own ruin, I've learned that boundaries aren't walls, they're doors you control. And sometimes, with a voicemail from Dad, closing one is the kindest thing you can do for yourself. Share your choice and your story in the comments, because somewhere out there, for when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Dad, someone's going through the same thing right now, and your voice might just be the one that helps them feel less alone.